Okay.
Cool.
Alright, thanks for hanging around, everyone. So what I'm going to do today is try and offer a new kind of explanation of the sense of agency for bodily actions. Some of you might know that I've previously been advocating the comparative model as a really good explanation. Today I'm going to give in to pressure from the rest of the scientific community and say, okay, it's not just the comparator model, and I'm going to try and elaborate what the addition to the comparator that we need is. So what I'm going to suggest is that sense of agency is elicited when you get matches in two kinds of metacognitive monitoring. So when you monitor actions and they appear sufficiently smooth, and this is going to be done via monitoring of the output of the traditional comparator. That's the comparison between actual and predicted sensory consequences. When those two things say same action, then positive cue for sense of agency, and the other is going to be by monitoring whether or not the action that you observe happening matches the your prior intention, so your goal, what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so this is all I want to do in terms of the framework of metacognition. So it's worth just saying a little bit about what metacognition is. And it's a bit of a a bastard term. It pops up in all sorts of places and means slightly different things under the general sort of heading of thinking about thinking, which is fairly non-specific, I think we'll agree. And so this ranges from anything from like explicit declarative theory of mind, I believe that you believe that, all the way down to very procedural type stuff. So I mean, what I want to mean by metacognition is, I'll say that a cognitive process is metacognitive if it represents and controls any other cognitive process. So the distinction here is between a metacognitive process and what we'll call an object level cognitive process. Object level because it's taken as the represented object of another cognitive process. So this gives us room for what Joël Proust has been calling the self-evaluative view of metacognition, but it's sort of the basic concept that you need to have in your head to understand what I'm on about is that this is more about regulation than making judgments about mental states. Okay. So within this we get another way of thinking about this distinction is a distinction between two kinds of metacognitive representations. So it's between metacognitive theories, which are theories about how your thinking works or how it ought to work, and between monitoring representations, which represent a process as it occurs. And it's the latter which are going to be of interest to us here. So these monitoring representations we generally operationalize via reports of how you're performing on a task. So if you give someone a paragraph or a poem or something to learn and you get them to say, when do you think you've learned it well enough that you could repeat it? That would be based on monitoring representation, in this case, a judgment of learning. So these as well, I mean, they're not always conscious. In a way, the one I'm kind of interested in today is conscious, but it's important that they're not all. So we see from Reder and Schun some nice examples of unconscious monitoring representations. So when people are asked to give confidence judgments about how likely they are to be correct in a particular response. So this can be just like a general knowledge question. How confident are you that you got the answer right? How confident people are is very strongly related to the speed at which they respond. So this, we think, gives us reason to believe that people are monitoring the speed at which they respond in order to make the confidence judgment. But of course no one knows that they're monitoring that, or at least people don't pre-theoretically know that they're monitoring that, which suggests that some of the monitoring is going on unconsciously. Okay, so where is a feeling of agency going to fit into this? Well, what I'm going to be suggesting is that, unlike some previous work where we've seen, actually based on some of Flavi's studies, the idea that metacognitive monitoring was involved in both deliberate inhibition of certain kinds of thinking and eliciting a sense of agency, in this case for acts of thinking rather than bodily actions. Here, for bodily actions, I don't think we have a reason to think that there's this intermediate layer, so I want us to start thinking about feeling of agency itself as a kind of monitoring representation. So this is a way of your motor system telling you, the subject, the broader cognitive system, or the global workspace, whatever you want to, however you want to phrase it, it's a way of the motor system telling you that you are doing such and such. Okay, so if we just bring up the model, this is the a first attempt to draw the model. I haven't been able to get rid of all the crossovers in the lines, unfortunately. But what we're seeing on the bottom half is a traditional comparator model. You can redraw it however you like. I draw it as particular representational content types within ellipses and computational transformations across solid arrows. Dashed arrows are non-computational transformations or not entirely computational transformations, so this is actually moving the body. So goal state specifies where the body's going, 2 copies of the motor command, one moves the body, giving you actual feedback, other goes to a predictor, produces a predicted sensory consequences, compared, labelled that smoothness monitoring. That's one cue for sense of agency. So far, that's just the standard comparator model, which we all know pretty well, right? The addition is going to be this comparison between proximal intention, which forms part of the broader section of beliefs about your action. So this is a belief about what I'm trying to achieve, sort of in a loose sense of, where we're going to throw all the propositional attitudes together into one lump of conscious thinking, I guess. Anyway, so when that matches what you actually observe happening, and that's going to be monitored, by what I'm calling outcome monitoring, that's another cue for this metacognitive feeling, the sense of agency. So that's the, in 2 minutes, I guess, a sort of canned version of the theory that I think is going to be a useful replacement for the comparator. So we don't need to worry too much more about it, but what I want to do is talk about just 2 studies, because I think that's all I have time for, that do put this kind of pressure on the comparator model, which has become very fashionable to talk about lately, which is this pressure that sometimes it seems that we get a bit of a sense of agency even when the motor system isn't making a prediction at all, or when it's making the wrong prediction. So I want to talk about a couple of studies which show that, and then how by adding this one additional cue we can get an explanation of that. Okay, so everyone's favourite example in this area, and the one that Matthias and that lot, Matthias and Obsik and that lot have made a big deal about, is Wegman's helping hand study. So for those who don't know this experiment, you have 2 people in the experiment, and you have one person stand there and they hold their hands by their side or hold them behind their back, and someone else comes along and gives them a cuddle, puts their arms through, and this is sort of roughly in the position where someone's hands would be up. It's pretty easy to know they're not your hands, but near enough. Okay, so during the experiment, people, the helper, that's the person behind with their arms through, is hearing a set of instructions through headphones, things like make the OK sign with both hands, or wave hello with your right hand. Now, the participant, the one who's standing there still, will hear a variety of other things, consistent or inconsistent with what they're seeing through their headphones. And the interesting case is when they hear the instruction that then gets performed. Because what we see is if you're standing there and you hear make okay sign with both hands, and then you see someone else do that through underneath your arms, that people do rate their agency over that condition higher than if they hear an inconsistent instruction or they hear the instruction too early. So a bunch of people have suggested, well, that this is a problem for the comparator model because that person who's just standing there, they're not making that prediction, not in the motor control sense. They might sort of more thoughtfully predict they will see such and such, but they're not going to run it through the motor control system in the way that we think where the comparator works. So what's going on here? Well, one idea which was obvious to Wegener and his lab is, well, maybe people are making very slight movements, or they're imagining the movement that they're hearing the instruction for in a way that is compatible with them, or rather that would cause them to produce the comparison, the prediction in the way required of the comparator. Now, so this was controlled for in the initial study, and you do is add two conditions and say, okay, when you hear the instruction, mimic the movement without lifting your arm. So if he's told, make the okay sign with both hands, you make it at your sides. Now, in that condition, you see a greater increase in sense of agency. Big deal. More interesting control condition is they said, no matter what instruction you hear, you make this distracted movement, which is tapping the side of your legs. So that's the prediction that should be coming through the motor control system. And what we see when subjects are in that condition is that their rating for their feeling of agency is the same as if they are given no instruction, which suggests that in the no instruction condition, the normal condition, that they're not just imagining it or doing something which could add to their feeling of agency in a way that would be compatible with the comparator model. Now, we've been throwing around some explanations of this in the literature for a few years now, and for a while, was quite keen on an explanation that Jones et al. Came up with, which was the idea that you could take, and this came from a slightly different paradigm of Wegener's, but one that had the same sort of basic result of priming the outcome of an action would lead to increases of feelings of agency. And so in this case, the prime is conscious. It's not in every paradigm, obviously, but the idea that we were throwing around for a while was that, well, maybe the prime is somehow mistaken for a prediction and entered into a comparator by mistake. But in the end, I think that the only reason really for favouring that kind of approach was that alternative models to the comparator model we either knew were false already, so thinking of Wegener's sort of high-level inferential model, we knew that made some false predictions. Or the other alternative was the synoptic type multifactorial model, which seemed to be too easy to make ad hoc adjustments to for it to be easily testable. So I kind of ran with this explanation because everything else seemed like it wasn't going to work. So I now think that we can move on from this by just, rather than doing the synoptic style thing of saying it's a whole bunch of factors which lead to the sense of agency, let's add just one more. And this we can keep pretty well defined. This will be the outcome monitoring. So this is going to be the basic suggestion here, that one of your cues for feeling of agency in this condition is still met. When you hear an instruction, and this is really important to keep in mind, that when you're in the helping hands experiment, is you're not just hearing something named, you're hearing an instruction. So wave your right hand. Now, and to understand an instruction, you need to form an intention. Now, obviously, you inhibit the intention so you don't act on it to comply with the rest of the instructions. for the experiment. But to know what's going on, you need to form this intention. So that intention is still there to be compared to the outcome. And in the instances where it does match, so in this, in the preview condition, as Wegener calls it, then you do have one cue for the sense of agency. But you still have a large negative cue as well, and there's no smoothness monitoring, there's no match at the traditional comparator between prediction and actual sensory outcomes. So this is important as well, because what we need to remember that we're explaining here is that we get a slight increase in feelings of agency in this condition, but not strong endorsement. You're getting, on a 1 to 7 scale, you're getting scores that average at 3 rather than 0. So you're wanting to know why it's gone up a bit, but not very far. So the two competing factors acting in opposite directions at the set cues offers a nice explanation of that. Okay, so one other kind of paradigm that offers us a similar kind of finding is a neat little game that comes from Janet Metcalfe and colleagues. I'll just talk about the first version of this. There are lots of nice versions, unfortunately, but I've only got time to talk about one. So what you do is you just play a game where you're moving a cursor with a mouse that it can only move horizontally, and you see falling X's and O's. Your task is just to catch one and avoid the other. Simple enough game. Now, you can throw in a few manipulations. One of the first ones they did was to just add a bit of random noise to the cursor so it didn't exactly track the motion that subjects were making with the mouse. Now, this sort of turbulence condition didn't make the game much harder to play. It makes it a little bit harder. You do get significantly fewer catches, but it's only 1 or 2. So it's not much harder to play. But as you'd expect, if you're a comparative theorist anyway, sense of agency drops quite a lot. So far, so good. The outcome that you're seeing isn't acting exactly as predicted, so sense of agency drops. But what is a bit more surprising is that there is still a strong correlation between successful catches and sense of agency judgments. Well, they call sense of agency judgments, but they're asking specifically about feelings. Anyway, talk about that in questions. So, I mean, this is another data that needs to be explained. Why would success on the task correlate with feelings of agency? Well, to test this, they came up with another condition which they call playfully the magic condition. Now, in this condition, the cursor moves as expected, but there's an extra radius around it within which a catch will count, but a false positive won't. So, extra little bit to the side of the cursor, the one you're trying to catch goes through it, counts as a hit, the one you're trying to miss goes through it, still a miss. Now, there are a couple of predictions that we can make about what should happen to feeling of agency here. If success on the task, or your perception of your success on the task, is a factor, then you think that in this condition you should get a higher feeling of agency because you're getting more catches. You're achieving your goal of playing the game well, so your sense of agency should be stronger. That is, if outcome matters as an independent factor. On the other hand, if outcome doesn't matter, what you should see is that either feeling of agency goes down because the game's no longer acting exactly as you learned it to, or if you can adapt to the new contingency pretty well, it should stay the same. Now, what we see in this condition is, first of all, that indeed performance does go up. People do catch more in this, as you'd expect. They've made the game easier. But also feeling of agency goes up as well. Now, this runs counter to the predictions from the comparator model, which says either it should go down or stay the same. It definitely doesn't allow that it goes up. One complication is that feeling of agency ratings don't go up by about 7%. So just to wind up very quickly, this seems to work well with the 2Q for feeling of agency kind of model, which I've been advocating here, because yes, monitoring of outcome is a cue for a sense of agency to go up, but there still is the fact that the game is working differently than it was before. So it's not acting as predicted, so your traditional comparator should be giving you a downward cue on feeling of agency. So I'll leave it there, but there's two kinds of studies which I think are more neatly dealt with by a two-factor metacognitive model than the traditional comparator model. Thanks.